You know, we all suffer from anxiety to one extent or the other, and the current climate isn't making things any better. But did you know that when a young person gets anxiety, especially in today's age, it can devastate their academic progress and potentially their career, and of course, everything that goes with it? Welcome to the Young Leaders Nexus podcast. My name is Harun Rabbani. Today, we're going to be diving deep into the topic that's increasingly affecting our young people today. As the pressures of school, social media, the energy crisis rises, so is anxiety rising exponentially for young people. This mental health crisis is devastating the academic careers, their mental health, the physical health of young people, and actually also of teachers. We cannot forget them because they are having to do an important job under very difficult circumstances. In this episode of Young Leaders Podcast, we're going to be debunking some of the myths associated with anxiety. Our guest for today is Caroline Cavanagh, a trained hypnotherapist who has been working privately and publicly with young people through their schools, of course, to help deal with anxiety issues from the moderate level all the way to very deep-seated anxiety. We're going to be focusing on the general anxiety that young people are facing, and actually as well as teachers. So let's explore what we can do to support our young people.
Thank you very much for having me, Harun. I've been really looking forward to this. So I'm an anxiety specialist and I work therapeutically with a lot of people. If we'd been having this conversation 10 years ago, I'd have said the typical people that I was working with were middle-aged women, but there has been a massive shift in a lot of my clients now are teenagers, which is indicative of the change in society and where anxiety is really manifesting itself predominantly now. I love going into schools and teaching some of the very practical techniques that when individuals use them, they're very effective. But when whole groups of people use them, it's that wonderful evidence. A whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So when collectively these very simple techniques are applied, there can really be a massive shift in energy, in positivity, and in learning. And that's ultimately what I'm all about, is helping people understand that anxiety is not a bad thing. It is a positive emotion, like all of the emotions are, and it's learning how to use that emotion so that anxiety becomes something that, rather than hindering you, actually helps you.
So that we're clear about what anxiety is, what is the difference between stress and anxiety?
So, anxiety is purely a word that we give to identify a feeling. So, all feelings are a chemical manifestation in the body. So, love, for example, means that we've got an awful lot of oxytocin swimming around in the system. Happiness means you've got serotonin in the system. And anxiety is the word we give to identify the feeling that has a role of improving our performance. So, in many ways, we're still cavemen. We're just a bit less hairy now because we've got radiators and walls to live within. But the role of anxiety is to keep us safe. That feeling of adrenaline being released into the system that makes your tummy turn into a washing machine, your heart race, is allowing your body to actually perform at a higher level, to either run away or fight whatever the perceived risk is. So, anxiety is a word that we give to a chemical reaction in the body. Stress is, again, a science. We talk about stress, we might put on a metal chain and it will then break at its weakest point. So, stress, again, is another word for a tangible feeling that we have in the body. It may be a headache, it may be a tension in the body, but it is just another word that is more physically related than anxiety can be. So there is such an overlap, and people tend to use them almost synonymously.
So the purpose of this episode is really focusing on general anxiety that people get, and particularly young people. For today's purposes, we're not going to step into PTSD right now. Why is it that young people are feeling a lot more anxiety than ever before? If at all, maybe they're not. What are your thoughts?
Because the perception of risk has been massively escalated. And it's very easy for us to go, oh, it's all down to social media and phones. Unfortunately, that is a big part of it. So I know we're a similar age, Harun. So when we were at school, you would naturally compare yourself to another human being that you knew. So I could look at another girl and go, she's much prettier than me, she's much slimmer than me, but I can run faster than her. So the parameters that we were comparing against were not only real, but they were actually much broader. Whereas now, a lot of the comparison is done on a device. So they can see another, another girl in my example and go, oh, she's much prettier than her. Therefore, I'm not as good as them because the parameters of comparison are very narrow and also in many cases not even real. So it means the exposure to risk is suddenly escalated where risk is seen in so many phases, and that causes the escalation in anxiety.
What about the role of the education system itself? So, for example, the number of GCSEs you have to get and the number of grades you have to, the academic route obviously has some impact, but how much has it contributing to this massive surge of anxiety across the board?
It's a really interesting one, and I've had a lot of debates with people around this because I had exams. We all had exams. Has that changed? Perhaps a little bit, but I don't think the changes really relate to feeding into the massive escalation of anxiety. It is just another ingredient in what is now a very big melting pot. So again, coming back to what I mentioned before, the other anxieties when we were younger were smaller. Therefore, when the exams came in as a proportion, they were still within a coping strategy. Whereas now, because everything else is almost out of control, this is the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back.
So, what does anxiety look like in a young person's physiological situation, so their body?
It varies person to person. What adrenaline does is it diverts the blood away from the central core, from the gut, out to the extremities. But when adrenaline is released in the body, it's actually very demanding. So if it's being stimulated regularly, the body will naturally switch to a chemical called cortisol. Cortisol in low levels is not a problem, but when that's being secreted regularly, it tends to have two very detrimental effects, and that is on the gut. There is now an awful lot of research looking at gut health and mental health and how closely they are related.
Mm.
So people will start to get things like upset tummies, inability to eat properly, because the whole gut system is out of kilter. But it will also then start to suppress the release of dopamine. So you're less able to think positively, to be happy, to let those things go over your head. And then we get into a downward spiral because the less happy and positive you are, the more risk you see, the more risk you see, the more cortisol is released. And so it goes into. So then you will start to get into risks of depression. And anxiety, when it is not treated, will often start to slip into depression.
So, we talked about the body, and you touched upon the stuff going on in the mental health arena. I mean, anxiety in itself is that. How does anxiety affect the brain in the context of a young person going through the schooling system?
Anxiety is there when there is a perception of risk. And the natural biological focus is when there is perceived risk, is to focus on that because I need to either run away or flee, or fight it. And in many cases, that risk is not real. So a teenager could be laying in bed at 2 a.m. in the morning, worrying about an exam the next day. That risk is not real, but it inhibits them from sleeping
Hmm.
because the body is going, I've got an exam, I've got to perform, I've got to be on high alert. And so when that is perpetuated all the time, it really inhibits the child's ability to
Hmm.
focus on the now. So a child can be sitting in a classroom listening to their history lesson, but their thought is about an exam that's the week after. So it's actually training the mind to not be present. It's one of the fundamental things that I do with a lot of teenagers is teaching them to be present in the moment.
Hmm.
Because if the risk is real in the moment, actually anxiety is a good thing because it's going to help you perform. So I'm a professional speaker as I use. So I actually embrace feeling anxious before I go on stage because I know the chemistry in my body at that point is going to facilitate me perform at a better level. But it's not going to help me at 3 a.m.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting because my part of my background is martial arts as well.
Mm,
And those times where I was so confident that I had no anxiety, no butterflies, I lost all those fights.
what done?
And the best ones, the anxiety didn't overwhelm me, the ones that I won. So when I became champion, they were high enough to keep me on my toes,
Yeah.
but not so high as to stop me from being able to be reactive and responsive and so on. So yeah, it is important. How However, a lot of people, of course, will be thinking, my child's got anxiety, or you might be that teenager, I've got anxiety. What's the cure for it? Is there a pill out there? What are your thoughts?
My instant reaction to that is there is not a pill out there, but I don't want to start getting down a pharmacological, I can't even say the word.
Pharmaceutical.
Thank you, thank you.
What's the cure?
In an argument on that way, that there is a role for drugs within treating mental health, but let's park that for now. Anxiety, as we've mentioned, is a positive thing. It's there to help you perform. And therefore, my approach is to help use anxiety in a way that allows you to grow rather than a way that holds you back.
Hmm.
So people often say, I have anxiety. We all do. And it's a fascinating thing that have you ever heard anyone say, I have happiness, I have love? We just say, it's like, I am happy, I am in love. So we embody the positive emotions, but we externalize the negative emotions. But when you again embody anxiety and go, I'm going to take control of my anxiety, then that's when you start to give anxiety leadership. And then the natural path from that is I'm feeling, very anxious. Why? Is there a real risk, or are you just responding to a thought? And as soon as you recognize you're responding to a thought that's not real in the moment, you go, well, that's pointless, isn't it?
Hmm.
Why am I worrying about something I can't do anything about? That has a chemical change. So it's all about giving anxiety leadership and learning to use it rather than anxiety as this disembodied external thing to you running you. It's the old cart and horse analogy. Who's in the driver's seat?
Hmm.
Is it you or is it anxiety? And the basis of the work that I do is putting you back in the driving seat and using anxiety to actually perform really well.
And this is the thing people have to wrap their heads around is anxiety is a set of chemicals taking part in your place in your body. So you can't really externalize that because it's physiologically, it's inside of you. And
Yeah.
when you've done the work in the past, and I know you still do it, but of course there has limitations because of geography. You've worked with people one to one. How long does it take for a young person to practice the coping mechanisms? And I'm hoping you'll share some. Practice those coping mechanisms. How long does it take for them to be in control of their anxiety?
It's again a wonderful question, and it's a very difficult one to answer because everyone's relationship with anxiety has evolved in a different way.
Hmm.
So I'm very much of the belief that one size does not fit all. So I don't use, processes or systems in my work with people. It's absolutely individualized. But there are several things, and there's a few techniques that I believe if they started to be used in schools, teachers using these on a daily basis would make a profound effect on the younger generation. The first one being what we've just spoken about. If someone's saying, I'm really anxious or I'm really worried about this, is just a simple, is what you're worrying about real or imagined? Because as soon as you bring that conscious recognition that I'm worrying about something that isn't real, that I can't do anything about at the moment, that starts to change the chemical reaction. My favorite one that a lot of people say is flip it. The mind will naturally catastrophize. So someone will say, what if? What if I fail my exams? And then the brain will answer any question you give it. Well, if I fail my exams, then I'm not going to be able to go on to college. And if I don't go on to college, I'm not going to be there. And before you know it, you know, you're living on the street because you failed the school system, but actually you're still sitting at a desk. Nothing's actually happened. So flip it is a very simple technique where you just do the opposite. What if I fail my exams? What if you don't? And then the brain goes off down that route. Well, if I
Hmm.
don't fail my exam, blah, and so it goes on. And flip it is such a powerful technique. And I have seen it used so effectively time and time and time again. So again, in classrooms, if teachers have this ability to when a child's saying, oh, what if I don't have any friends? But what if you do? The brain is naturally then goes, well, if I do that thought pattern, and the brain starts to focus on the positives rather than the negatives. So back to your original question, when I work therapeutically, I use hypnosis as the main therapeutic tools, and it gets really down to the root of what's causing that anxiety. And the changes in teenagers can be really quick. I often say hypnosis is a little bit like Marmite with teenagers. They either love it or they hate it.
Hmm.
And I've seen profound changes in teenagers after 3 or 4 sessions. If we're talking a little bit at this more macro level, then it takes a longer period of time, because it is like exercising the mind. It's like going into the gym. If you go into the gym every day and you do some press ups, you're going to build biceps and really strong arms, but it will take a little bit of time. So every day, if you're practicing, I'm recognizing it, real or imagined. It's imagined, I don't need to focus on it now. In time, straight away, the brain starts to do that, but it does take a little bit of time. But again, whether that's a week, 3 weeks, 3 months, is going to vary individual by individual, how much they're practicing it, how much they're actually using it.
What's the difference between an anxiety and an anxiety attack or a panic attack?
So a panic attack is an acute form of anxiety. It's where the brain has got absolutely myopically focused on a risk. And again, often that risk is not real, but the brain has kicked into that perception that it is real and really narrowed down on everything. So in a panic attack, people's breathing becomes really, really hindered because the heart is beating so fast because of that adrenaline, the massive adrenaline rush into the body. So it is a very acute form. And something it's one of the things that I go into schools and do is help people understand what actually are panic attacks. And the most important thing is to recognize is they will not hurt you. No one dies from a panic attack. It is just an extremely unpleasant physiological experience where there is a massive increase in adrenaline in the body. And again, when you recognize this, I'm safe, that immediately starts to change that adrenaline release and gives you access to different tools to then de-escalate that process.
One of my siblings is a teacher, and he's been going through a lot of challenges, and he's been having panic attacks. And I've done a lot of anxiety work. I don't specifically do that with young people because I've got another area I focus on anyway, which is employability and entrepreneurship. But what I found was when he visited me literally this weekend, we were conversing, and I was watching him. And I said to him, by the way, do you actually breathe? He sits there, not breathing. I observed him all, not all weekend, all day. And I thought, that's the root cause of your problem is number one, you're not breathing. Number two, you're always thinking. Your mind's always active. And so I was surprised he didn't know this technique, but there's a technique I use from when my kids were little. They're in their 20s now, which is NLP technique, which is looking up. So when they're on the ground, they fall over. I look upward towards the ceiling as if there's something up there. And I go, what's that? And then look up, and I might even say there's a spider because there probably was one. Instantly, crying stops. It's very difficult to go into anxiety mode or even think properly if you're looking upwards. It's such a neutral space. On the other hand, when someone's anxious or even depressed, where do they look? They're always looking down, right? And it's that
Mm.
whole thing, the terminology of, hey, life's not that bad. Look up, look outwards, rather than, things are looking down, when people say things are bad, looking down, even in the language, it's the hints are there, the healing methodologies are there. Now, a lot of teachers, of course, they're feeling burnout. They're sick and
Mm.
tired of the fact that they're not teaching and they're doing so much other than teaching. And there's huge numbers of teachers leaving the industry, leaving the profession. Is it possible for someone like you, because I know you do, I've seen you speak and present, is it possible for someone like you to help these teachers out? Obviously, not everyone, but maybe in large enough numbers to help save their jobs and also actually train them to look after the young people?
Absolutely.
Right.
I think the most important start for any of us to anything that we do is to have a purpose. My perception is people go into teaching because they want to educate.
Hmm.
No, it's not somewhere where you're going to make £1 million. It's a calling, should we say. And so if that calling is there and we have a strong enough purpose, we can do absolutely anything. And so that would be the starting point, is what is the purpose behind teaching, and reignite that. And then we give some of the coping strategies, some of the things like, for example, when you're feeling stressed, breathing. You will rapidly breathe under a stress because, again, that's what adrenaline is telling you to do. And one of the very simple breathing techniques that I teach teenagers, because it's inherent in all of us, is just to breathe out. Imagine blowing a candle out on a cake, but you don't want to quite blow the flame out. Just a very, very slow, long out breath. Because as soon as you empty your lungs, the next thing you're going to do is breathe in really big.
Hmm.
But when you're doing this shallow breathing, that is actually perpetuating the stress response. So as soon as you breathe deeply and slowly, everything just calms down. And when you click out of that fight or flight mode, you see things differently. Your focus changes. So even something as simple as changing your breathing can help reduce that stress.
So we'll talk about a few more things, but just in case anyone's interested, I do strongly urge teachers to consider taking you in as a trainer for them and the students as well. I really do. This is way too important. I've spoken to audiences like teenagers, probably about 250,000 of them up and down the country, and this is over a long period of time. And it's horrible. It's horrible to see that just the bare basics aren't taught. It's not teachers' fault, it's not about fault, it's just that people aren't aware. And yet it can destroy young people's lives, the decisions they make, the things they avoid. I spoke
Mm.
at a sixth form, I think it was last year. 120 young people, they're engaged and they're interactive, but my goodness, they're very anxious about even talking to anybody. One of them was due to go into Oxbridge, one of the Oxbridge unis. She was that bright, but she has massive anxiety attacks when it comes to interviews. And I don't know how they thought she's going to just ride them out. They're worried about it, but they don't know what to do. I feel there are opportunities for you to help others. So how do people get hold of you?
My website is a first place to start, and that's very simply carolinecavanagh.co.uk. There's lots of free downloadable resources on there, lots of hints and tips on blog pages. And from there, best thing is just contact me. Let's have a chat. I love going into schools, working with groups of students themselves. You know, I've done assemblies or getting whole year groups together because, again, when cumulatively everyone is hearing the same message, that's when the connection is really profound. But I do also really love working teacher training days. Because again, if all of the teachers are then perpetuating these same messages
Mm.
and the children are hearing the same thing in their maths class, in their English class, in their history class, that's when, again, real big differences are made. And it helps the teachers at the same time. So it's a win-win all around.
Brilliant. So I'm going to make sure we share this recording on various Facebook groups and LinkedIn groups where teachers are, and I hope you're able to do the same. Let's move to a different topic, ADHD, and then we'll talk briefly
Mhm.
about autism. I don't know if you how much knowledge or awareness you have. I grew up with ADHD, not knowing it until earlier this year. My goodness, it explains so much of my own anxiety and the
Yep.
disconnect I've had all my life. How does anxiety and ADHD, what's the interrelationship between those two?
So I want to be very clear, I'm not medically trained, so I don't give medical advice. My issue with ADHD is that it's called a disorder. And I feel very strongly it is not a disorder.
Hmm.
Someone who has been given the diagnosis of ADHD is someone whose wiring in their brain is slightly different to the majority. And the metaphor that I think helps most people is I was told that my grandfather was left-handed, and in Victorian times, that was deemed to be a weakness. And so he had his left hand tied to his side and forced to write with his right hand. The silver lining is he ended up being ambidextrous. But mentally, we are now doing a very similar thing. People with ADHD, their wiring, their way of learning, their way of behaving is outside of what we perceive to be the norm, how the school systems are structured. ADHD people, all of the children that I have worked with ADHD diagnosis, are absolutely phenomenal learners, but they don't learn by sitting at a desk. But the school makes them sit at a desk, which is, the modern day equivalent of tying their left hand to their side.
What an analogy. What an analogy. You know, when I've spoken at schools and the teachers shouting at us, one or two young people, I kind of like have a sneaky word with them, not sneaky word, but when I get to chat with them, I think, oh my goodness, this person's a genius. They need to
Yeah,
be in the class, and
yeah.
instead they get excluded. And if you look at entrepreneurs, a significant portion of entrepreneurs and achievers across the industries actually got ADHD. When it comes to autism, autism is something that is, can be very severe. Forgetting for a moment the severe ones, because that's a different kettle of fish altogether. How does anxiety manifest itself for young people with moderate levels of autism? Is it similar? Is it different?
Anxiety is often higher with people who have an autism diagnosis because almost of what we've just been talking about. The system says you need to do it like this, but my brain is saying I need to do it like this. I need to do it in a different way. And that then creates stress right the way back almost to where we started, because there is a friction between what the system is telling you to do and the internal system of way that you want to do it that's comfortable for you.
Hmm.
So you're being forced to work in a way that's not congruent with your internal wiring. That then creates friction, another word being stress, another word being anxiety, because it's outside of my comfort zone to work in this way. And anything that's outside of your comfort zone is a perception or leads to risk because you're vulnerable.
Is there a message you'd like to share, final message you'd like to share with teachers and students? So I guess as if you're talking to students, but via the teachers, is there a particular message you'd like to share with them?
It sounds a bit flippant, but it is, but genuinely hang in there, because autistic, ADHD, and again, there's often an overlap between the two. Children with these diagnoses, with this wiring, in my experience, have an exceptional talent in something.
Hmm.
And it's finding out what that talent is. My brother, for example, would have been diagnosed as a child. He was very dyslexic. So he was told as a child that he'd never achieve anything. He was stupid. Even now, his writing looks like a drunken spider. But he is the most phenomenal chef and won Young Chef of the Year. So his exception is in the kitchen. Could do a whole podcast on stories of children that there is something that they are always exceptional at. And that comes back to your point. A lot of successful people in whichever field have either autism or ADHD that has facilitated them becoming exceptional.
Hmm.
So the message I would like to get across is you are exceptional.
Absolutely amazing. I really hope you get yourself out there. If you were interviewing you, is there a
Mhm.
question that you would have asked that perhaps I've left out?
Question I get asked quite often by people is how are we going to resolve this anxiety crisis?
How are we going to get, how are we going to, how are we going to deal with this anxiety crisis, Caroline?
It is not a short-term fix, and the more we continue to see it as a short-term fix, the more it is going to be perpetuated. We need to get back into schools, and the earlier the better, and start retraining children to recognize that anxiety is a positive thing and give them the tools to give that anxiety leadership so that anxiety helps them grow rather than holds them back.
Caroline Cavanagh, that was brilliant. Thank you ever so much for joining the Young Leaders Nexus podcast. We definitely want you back, but more importantly than having you on the shows to get you out there across as many schools as possible, help these young leaders, I believe, to become titans in their field. Thank you once again.